Weeds in the vegetable garden. Over the years, I've talked to quite a few people about growing their own food, and I've never heard anyone say that they enjoyed having weeds in their vegetable garden. Weeds can rob our plants of nutrients. They can also just make the garden look unsightly, not aesthetically pleasing. And if we let those weeds get out of control, we know we're going to have lots of continuing problems for years to come. So today I want to talk about one thing, and in my opinion, probably the most important thing that we do to keep the weeds down in our vegetable gardens. Now, weeds in your garden are going to come from three primary sources. One of them, and this is probably the main one, is your weed seed bank in your actual garden soil. And we do things to try to keep that weed seed bank as low or as depleted as possible so that we don't have, weeds continually germinating in our plots. So when we do get weeds, we try to, eliminate them or remove them when they're small before they go to seed, so they don't eventually contribute to that weed seed bank. So if we keep that weed seed bank small, that's going to help out a ton. Now, the other two factors are more environmental factors, and those are wind and then animals. So animals, birds fly around, birds eat plants, they consume those seeds, they poop in the garden, and then we get seeds added to our weed seed bank that way. The other way is through wind. We have grass and other weeds maybe on the outside of our garden, and the wind blows and blows those seeds into our garden plots. So just like we see right here, where I need to come in here and cut my grass on these paths between my garden plots, we've got some sprigs of bahia grass popping up there and got seeds on those heads there, and if the wind was to pick up, it could blow those seeds right into my garden and contribute to the weed seed bank. So it's also a good idea to keep your grass cut. I'm not a very good example here right now, but keep the grass low beside your garden plots, and that will help to not contribute to that weed seed bank as well. Now, as far as those two kind of environmental factors go, there's not a whole lot we can do about that. We can't stop animals from doing their thing. We can't stop the wind from blowing. But assuming those weed seeds are going to get in the garden one way or the other, we can do things to make sure or make it harder for them to germinate. So the one big thing we do around here to reduce our weed pressure and just make our gardens easier to work with, make our plants more healthy so they get all the nutrients we're giving to them, they don't get robbed by the weeds, is we put water right where the plants need them, and we don't water the area between our rows where we don't have anything growing. And we do that using drip irrigation. So we're not throwing water over the entire plot, watering all those spaces between the rows. We're just putting the water right where the plants need it, and we're going to reduce the total amount of weed seed germination we have in our plots by doing that. So let's take a look at this plot of sweet corn here that's just starting to tassel. So we have basically planted the corn right on top of our buried drip irrigation. And what that does is allows us to water just right there where the plants need it. We're not putting a lot of water here between the rows and feeding any weed seeds that might be in there. Now, this is not to say we don't get any weeds. We still get a few weeds popping up here and there. If you look down that row there, you can see it's pretty clean in there. And we haven't had a lot of rain this spring, and that works just fine for us because we can feed those plants right where we need them, and we're not feeding or watering this soil here between the rows, and as a result, we're not going to have a whole lot of weed issues. Now, we do believe in a technique I call frequent shallow cultivation to keep those weeds down between the rows should they emerge. And if we have a real wet spring, we're going to have a lot more weed pressure because we've got a lot more water coming down from the sky feeding those spaces between rows. But this spring, for example, it's been pretty dry around here, and I know some of you out there haven't been that fortunate. It's been really wet where you live, but here it's been pretty dry, and I kind of like growing in a dry spring more than I do a wet spring, because then if it's dry I can put the water right where I want it. And to be honest, I haven't had to cultivate hardly any this spring. Some of these plots I've just wheel hoed maybe once or twice, and instead of doing it every week, which I usually have to do, I've only had to do it every 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 weeks, just because no water between those spaces between rows means no weeds germinating. The garden stays nice and clean that way because we're only putting water where we need it. Here's another good example here with this pepper plot. Now, I haven't cultivated this plot here in I think at least 3 weeks. Now I do got some weeds popping up here now because we got a little shower earlier this week. But before we had that shower, everything was just looking nice and clean in here. So after a rain, I will have to get in here because that rain will trigger some weed growth between the rows. But with that drip tape buried right there, as long as we're not getting tons of rain, we're just not going to have a lot of weed pressure, and it's just going to save us a ton of time in our garden. And it also proves true with these tomatoes right here. We all have just so much time we can spend in the garden, so that time is valuable. We want to make sure it is spent as efficiently as possible. And just like the peppers, I just haven't had to cultivate between these tomatoes here. I've been able to come out here when I'm working with tomatoes and spend more time making sure everything's trellised up nice, everything's growing good, everything's been, fertilized well. I haven't had to spend a lot of time fighting the weeds here, and that's because we're not watering these spaces right here where we would normally have to fight the weeds. And that's why you see some nice clean pathways there, because we're not putting any water on them. And my final good example here is this plot of winter squash, where we got our South Anna butternut there, and on the end we've got that table ace acorn squash. And you can see we've got lots of dense foliage here, which is also going to help with weed pressure. But if I were watering this via overhead sprinkler, I would be getting a lot of weeds germinating out there in the middle there, and they would find their way up through that foliage, especially pigweed, stuff like that. And there would be no way for me to get in there and pull those weeds without just completely damaging my plants. So I just have to let them grow and then deal with them later after they've gone to seed and everything. But since we've got drip irrigation buried beneath each one of these rows here, and we're only feeding, that tiny lane right there where those plant roots are, we don't have to worry about a whole lot of weeds popping up in the middle here. Now, there are quite a few benefits to using drip irrigation in the garden. It's not just weed control or weed suppression. With drip irrigation, you're going to save a ton of water. Going to keep your water bill down, keep your well nice and full. Whatever your means of watering is, you're going to be using a lot less water by using drip irrigation. It's also going to help out with your disease pressure a ton. Most disease pressure is kind of fed by leaf moisture. So if we can reduce that leaf moisture, we can reduce our disease pressure, and we can have healthier plants, longer throughout the growing season there. But the number one for me this year, the number one benefit of drip irrigation has been simply that my weed pressure has pretty much been non-existent. Now, like I said earlier, we can't control how much it rains. In a rainy year, this may not be as important as it has been this year. But this year, man, it has just been a lifesaver and saved me so much time in my garden, where I'm not out here having to fight the weeds every day, and I can spend time doing other stuff, harvesting, planting new stuff, taking care of my plants, all that good stuff. And it's just gonna make for a better garden this spring. So if you're consistently losing the weed battle in your garden, I would highly recommend giving drip irrigation a try. I talked to a lot of people who have started using drip irrigation for the first time the last couple years, and of all the benefits, probably the number one thing we hear is, man, I just can't believe how many fewer weeds I have watering this way as opposed to using an overhead sprinkler like I was doing before. If you're out there and you've been using drip irrigation in your garden and you've seen the benefits, put in the comments below why you like it. Why do you think it's a better way to water? Is it disease pressure? Is it just conserving water? Or is it the weed control, which has been important for us this year? And if you haven't started using drip irrigation and you still have some questions about it, maybe you're a little bit nervous about trying it, put any questions or concerns you may have in the comments below, and I'll be glad to answer them for you. I'll put some links below to our drip irrigation kit so you can check those out if you want to use one of those in your vegetable garden to help control weeds and all those other great things. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give me a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell button so you get notified every time we come out with a new video. And check out these other two videos right here, ones we've did in the past on drip irrigation as well. I think you'll like those too. We'll see you next time.